The city of York has hardly changed from the Middle Ages until the present day. At present, it's experiencing a revival which is attracting industry and tourists. More and more people are coming to work in or to visit York, and these people need somewhere to stay. This is a model of the Forum Hotel. At the beginning of 1973, it was not built, but its site was decided. It was going to be built here, in Museum Street, on the site of this building, the old museum chambers. It was suspected that 2,000 years ago, this was the site of a Roman barrack block, and permission was given to dig through the present building basement, the old ballroom. At the bottom of a 7-foot hole, the diggers came across traces of the Roman walls. The builders decided to incorporate the Roman remains within the new hotel, but this is an exceptional case. Usually, any such remains are completely wiped out by the new development. The rivers Ouse and Foss, the two rivers on which York is based. The Ouse is an easy route to the sea, and at this point it crosses the natural land route over the Vale of York. In the area between the two rivers, the Romans, in the 1st century AD, established a legionary fortress during their advance northwards. Roads linked this fortress, Eboracum, to other forts. A town grew up round the fort, and in the 3rd century this was formalized by the building of the Colonia, a civil town on the other side of the Ouse. Cemeteries lay all round the town and the fortress. Eboracum must have been one of the most flourishing towns in northern Europe by the end of the 4th century. What happened after that in the early Saxon period is uncertain. River management seems to have broken down, and there was frequent flooding. People were still living here, as we can see from the cemeteries which have been discovered in and around the city. In the Middle Saxon period, the town was probably centered on the old legionary fortress, whose walls still stood. But by late Saxon times, it had moved to the riverside again, and to a small area in the southwest. Many of the modern streets had been established, and a new bridge replaced the Roman one. The blue dots show where archaeological finds have proved that people were living, using the riverside and the wharves for trade. The Vikings were the next inhabitants of the city and established a kingdom which controlled northern England. Then the Normans conquered the city, and as a result, the layout changed considerably. They built 2 castles, and by damming the foss, formed a great pond which became a part of the city's defences. The town grew. The ramparts were built, almost certainly on their present line, and the walls were added later. St. Mary's Abbey was built on the west side. The minster, too, was in its present position by this time. Suburbs developed outside the city walls in the 12th century, and the town continued to expand up until the late 14th century, by which time the walls we see today were built. This street plan is recorded more or less accurately on a map of 1610. It shows many of the streets that existed in the late Middle Ages. Also the minster in its final form. Nowadays, York has spread further, although much of its central area is unchanged. If you excavate anywhere within this area, you're likely to find one or more, or perhaps all, of the periods which go to make up York's history. The city is still developing, and new structures are being built all the time. At present, for instance, a new inner ring road is proposed. If this is built, it will destroy buried evidence over a vast area. Peter Addiman, director of the York Archaeological Trust, explains the problem.
To archaeologists, modern development poses something of a threat, but also a great opportunity. As new buildings quarry away the buried archaeological layers that represent the city's past, there's a brief chance to step in and do an excavation and to record the evidence before it's swept away forever. Now, this is a problem which faces historic towns throughout the country at present, but in York it was particularly severe, so that in 1972 national and local archaeological bodies got together to set up a York Archaeological Trust to do this work systematically. The Trust now has laboratories, offices, and a mobile team capable of tackling any site at almost a moment's notice. This film tells the story of one summer of the Trust's work, when we were faced with the need to excavate something like 50 sites scattered all over the city. You can see them on this map. We had to choose 4 for detailed excavation, and the film shows the story of what we were able to achieve. The first site was the cattle market, where a medieval suburb was thought to lie. 2, the Ebor brewery site, a site in the heart of the town whose development was not precisely known and where previous excavations had turned up human bones. 3, a site by the river where Roman and medieval dockland was anticipated. 4, a site within the Colonia where continuous habitation from Roman times to the 20th century was known. Then there was a special case, the Bedern area, where it was possible to plan for an extended excavation of 2 or 3 seasons as against the rescue nature of the other 4 sites. David Palliser, the York Archaeological Trust historian.
Here is a model of the city centre constructed for the recent ring road inquiries. It shows almost every building still standing inside the walls. Let's start by taking a look at the medieval suburb that lay here outside the walls between Wormgate and Fishergate bars. This area was the site of the York cattle market until 1970 and has now been cleared for redevelopment. Why was it worth investigation? Let's go back and see what historical evidence there is on the site. This is the first proper plan of York, drawn by John Speed in 1610. If we go into the cattle market area on this map, close to the windmill, we'll see that it's blank, but we do know from previous records that before this plan was drawn, there'd been a medieval suburb outside Fishergate Bar, and also a church. When the cattle market was built, in the 1820s and the 1850s, human bones were found all over the area, but they gave no clear indication of the church's position. However, the site became available, and we decided we would dig 2 areas out of its total of 4 acres.
This is going to be the site of a new swimming pool. The first stage of urban archaeology is usually the clearance of surface debris, and sometimes even concrete. The whole of this cattle market was covered in concrete, and we were going to dig 2 small areas in it. Would we find the church or traces of the suburb? The work was slow and tedious. The ground was alternately very hard or very sticky. Some bones were found, but not human bones, and not in great quantities, nor did the anticipated church materialize. Finds were cleaned and carefully assessed. At the end of the dig, we had a series of post holes where the posts of buildings or fences had stood, some belonging to the cattle market, some a good deal earlier. Martin Redmond is the site supervisor.
In front of me, we have a mid-Saxon pit of the 8th century. In this pit, we have a collapsed wall constructed of wattle and daub, indicated by the red daub and the burning. This indicates that in this area there was a Saxon building, and all we have left is this rubbish pit. The date of this was proven by 2 8th century coins and a 9th century brooch. On the other side, we have 15th to 16th century drainage gullies for farming. We've also running north to south 2 Romano-British field ditches.
And that was all. The excavations on this site showed that it was predominantly open land, with a few houses and other structures, but mostly it was agricultural land, and remained so until the 19th century. The church was not found, but may be located in a future excavation. On the next site we looked at, in contrast, we found something that we hadn't expected, rather than not finding something that was expected. It's here, in the Old Walk area, just inside the walls. This is the second of our 4 rescue sites. It's located within the walls, but just outside the Roman fortress. Here we can expect to find continuous occupation from Roman times onwards. Here is Speed's plan again, and this is the site with housing lining the street here. The Eboracum brewery occupied the site for 100 years until it was demolished in 1970. So the land was available, but where should we start digging?
What happened is that the York Excavation Group, an amateur group, cooperated with the Trust and dug several test trenches. In one of these test trenches, they found a large number of human bones. It was in the northeast corner of this site, which is at the top of the picture. The skeletons were discovered in and around this building. It was an unexpected find, the foundations of a church or chapel.
This provided a real puzzle. What could it be? Archaeology shows that this church has a very early origin, before any documents survive. The white line shows the first phase, and it existed until about 1550, when it had grown to this size. The skeletons so far unearthed have indicated a normal cross-section of a medieval population, of old and young, male and female, so early ideas that it could have been a guild or hospital chapel and cemetery had to be abandoned, as the picture only fits a normal parish church. Only one parish church was ever in this area, that of St. Helen on the Walls, and it looks more and more likely that it is St. Helen's that we have found. Historians of York, since Drake's time, 1736, have thought that St. Helen's had stood further north, in a position marked F, whereas our excavation has taken place just below the figure 54 on the plan. We know from documents that St. Helen's was in existence for at least 400 years, until it was demolished in 1550, and the archaeological evidence fits well with such a lifespan. In fact, this is a good example of a site where archaeology and history can help each other. The evidence of the skeletons will be very important in its own right, telling us much that cannot be learned from documents. Modern analysis of skeletons can discover much about the height and age of those buried, their physical type, and even in some cases the diseases they suffered from. Mrs. Dawes has the task of analysing the bones.
Here we have the bones of a young adult. Adult because the ends are fused onto the shaft, but as you will see here and here, this has occurred fairly recently. This occurs in the late teens, so the age of this individual was probably about 20 to 25. They are very slight bones. The joint sizes are very small. In a male skeleton, this would probably be much bigger, even though the bone may be the same length. So this is pretty certainly a female of about 20 to 25 years.
It's hoped that the lengthy study of the St. Helen's skeletons, and over 1,000 have been excavated so far, will give a good picture of a cross-section of the city's population. So that's our second site, a previously unexpected church. The discovery made us go back to the documents and histories and re-examine their evidence, and the site has provided a good example of archaeological discoveries correcting long-held ideas.
All this area containing the Eboracum brewery site is known as the Old Walk, and is scheduled for selective redevelopment. One particular part of it is of extreme archaeological interest. It's this, the Bedern area. This is our special case, where it's been possible to plan for an extended digging campaign of 2 or 3 seasons, as against the hurried rescue excavations on the other sites. So far, this is the only part of this area to have been excavated. There are many difficulties, but to help solve them, and others like them, there's the Executive Committee, composed of members of the Trust and of York Corporation. The chairman of the committee is Professor Maurice Barley.
We now come to the question of the Old Walk development. Can you tell us precisely what is the area available in the present circumstances?
30 metres square.
Can you put this into context for us, Mr. Addiman?
Yes, well, the problem here is that we have negotiated over some time with the corporation for access to a sample area of the Old Walk site, which is some 16 acres, due for selective redevelopment. And we've come to the conclusion that archaeologically this was the most useful area. It contains remains of the medieval college of the Vicars Choral, possibly a Saxon church, and we know there are extensive Roman remains of the legionary fortress below. Now, we propose to spend perhaps 2 years before the Old Walk scheme gets going, doing a careful, orderly excavation. We therefore put in an application recently to the Planning Committee for permission to do this and to have the buildings, which are currently occupied by William Wrights, removed from the site. Unfortunately, the Planning Committee and ultimately the full council felt that the buildings should be relet pending the site being developed. This seems to be a bit of a disaster. The project we anticipated there was a rather special one, in which we did have a formal scheme in an orderly manner rather than the usual incredible rush we're faced with, and it's a site that's perhaps as important as any in the country for the way in which it demonstrates a complete sequence in a vital area of York.
You say that this has gone not only to the planning committee but also to the full council. Is that so, Miss Hargreaves?
That is so.
Yes.
The planning committee, which is concerned about the redevelopment of this area, felt that the excavation work would perhaps interrupt the possibility of letting some of these buildings. I know the planning committee is very concerned about the neglected and derelict sites in York, and I think their feeling was that perhaps the Old Walk area would become such a site, and if the buildings could be used even on a temporary basis,
yes,
this would be to the advantage of the city.
The 2 areas discussed in the Executive Committee meeting are these. On one, the excavation has already started. On the other, it's hoped to start in the future. We'll have a look at the dig so far. Look at the gate in the wall. Beyond it, the present lane can be seen between the ancient buildings in the background. This lane was also there in the Middle Ages. You can see it on the excavated site where the 2 people are standing. In the centre of the picture are the foundations of houses which fronted the lane. The black area near the top of the picture was one of the kitchens. Peter Mills is the site supervisor.
This is the probable site of the kitchen of the house. You can see here a fireplace associated with the clay layer that came to about here is lying on the charcoal floor. The hearth itself was destroyed later, and you can see up this end another small oven that has also been partially destroyed. The actual floor down here is probably a result of the rake-out from the various fires in the area, and of course it's the thick charcoal deposit is the result. Up here we have another small hearth which has been destroyed, with 2 small stake holes showing where a wooden hood at one point covered it. Over here, the whole kitchen has in fact been cut by a car inspection pit.
That was the part we've been allowed to dig so far. A large part of the Bedern area consists of the college of the Vicars Choral, and this is the part that is lying underneath the present buildings. So now let's have a look at the greater possibilities afforded by the more formal layout of the Vicars Choral. This existed on a small street, which is still here through this archway.
I'm now standing here in the College of the Vicar's Choral, which in the Middle Ages was a college of minster priests, with the gatehouse in front of me, and you can see here the remains of the medieval chapel. And over behind the chapel, there are still the remains of the medieval hall, surviving in the middle of factory premises. Behind me, the street here was, in the Middle Ages, an enclosed court with 36 small houses of the priests grouped around it. This is a particularly interesting area to excavate, if we're given permission, because we hope we may be able to recover the complete plan of the whole college. All the 36 houses, the gardens, the orchards behind them, as well as the hall and the kitchen and the chapel, because we've got a great many property deeds going right back to the 13th century for this area, so that it should be possible to have a really well-integrated dig with archaeological and historical evidence.
The property deeds for the Vicar's Choral are still in existence. They are kept in the Minster Library.
The Bedern was very well documented compared to most parts of York. There are a great many leases and property deeds that help us to establish just where all the buildings used to be in the college. Here, for instance, we have a lease of 1765 by which the vicars were leasing a dwelling house that's very precisely described as being on the south side of the chapel, situate within the Bedern, and giving the other borders of the property down to the Bedern Hall, so that we can work out from this lease just where the house ought to be that we should excavate for. We can in fact go back much further than this by way of property documents. If we take, for instance, this description of the Bedern in 1276, which is the earliest mention of the college, we find here that it is explained that the Bedern is of the land of Blessed Peter, that is the Minster, and it tells us just when the various parts of the Bedern were given to the vicars, and tells us also about some extra bits of property between the Bedern and Aldwark, which were given to them afterwards. We're not quite yet able to say just where all of these bits of property were, but it should be possible from the mess of documents and working backwards to establish the precise location of all of them. Unlike the Bedern, the next site we looked at, across the river in Skeldergate, was much less well documented.
It's here. The reason we chose to excavate here was that the year before, in 1972, we dug here, by the riverfront. The 1972 dig had shown that the river frontage had been extended by building river walls and infilling behind them, a process which continued throughout the Middle Ages. As a result, on our third site, we expected to find traces of Roman and medieval wharf buildings. The third site looked like this at the beginning of the summer season, and like this at the end. So let's go back to the beginning and examine what is involved in urban archaeology.
York, for the archaeologist, is a city of backyards, deep trenches, sewers, and road construction. The watchwords are growth and development, the key phrases and techniques of the civil engineer. But now the growth is of knowledge, and the development is in theories about the city's past appearance. The archaeologist is the civil engineer of academic inquiry, and not of modern civilized comforts. The two priorities are always close. On the one hand, the need of the city developer to complete his work of construction as rapidly and efficiently as possible, and on the other, the need of the city archaeologist to obtain as much information as possible before its destruction. The advantages of forward planning in deciding where to deploy the archaeological task force is absolutely necessary. Rescue operations cannot always be mounted at a moment's notice, nor can research questions be formulated without preparatory documentary study. The result is seen in the range of sites tackled during this one summer in York. The uncertainties of predicting what will be found from excavation also emerges clearly, but a large urban team permits a versatile deployment of supervisors and workers according to rapidly changing circumstances. A permanent urban team can also have considerable advantages. It's closely identified with the city in which it works. It has continuous experience of soil conditions and the material evidence from excavations. The whole process of preliminary survey, field excavation, and laboratory examination is conducted within the team. The result is a communal federal product of a number of disciplines interacting upon one another. Urban archaeology on this scale is still at a relatively young stage of growth in this country. It cannot hope to have solved all the growing pains straight away. There will be sites that fail to yield the anticipated information, and there will be historical questions incapable of solution. But by using to the full the wide range of coordinated skills, we can plan our archaeology more efficiently for the future. This site in Skeldergate is now covered over so that work can continue throughout the winter. This was the first part of the dig within the Roman colonia. We'll now go on to have a look at the second part of the dig, which is 100 yards further up the hill. This is a model of what Roman York might have looked like. The colonia is on the other side of the river. The Skeldergate site was here. And the site we're now going to look at, Bishop Hill, is here.
On this site, we expected to find quite a lot of Roman remains, but of course on top of the Roman layers are many others, right up to the present day. This drawing by Whittock of 1858 shows the Victorian factory which occupied the whole of the site up to the time of our excavation. The factory was in fact demolished in 1970.
Now, before this factory was built, the site lay open for 100 years.
Martin Carver is the site supervisor.
Now, over here, against the section, you can see the fields that built up during this 100 years. It's a layer of black earth, and underneath it is a layer of rubble destruction. Right, I'm standing now on the southern edge of the site, and we see here, reflected in this section, the same sequence as I've just mentioned. Here is the factory destruction, here is the black layer, and here is the destruction of the building which stood before the field.
All that remains of this building is the wall that Martin Carver is standing on, but we do know what this wall belonged to. It was in fact the town house of the Fairfax family, county gentry who included Sir Thomas Fairfax of Civil War fame, and the house later passed to his son-in-law, the Duke of Buckingham, Charles II's favourite, who rebuilt and extended the house and made it into a centre for both city and county society. So this was a very important building to York, and yet, apart from this one engraving of 1718, we've almost no illustrations of it at all, and we haven't even got a plan, so that every little bit of information about it that we can learn from excavation is in addition to our knowledge of York.
Before the Duke of Buckingham's house was built, that is to say during the Middle Ages, occupation seems to have been quite sparse on the site. And the next thing that has happened is that all over our area now are emerging fragments of Roman occupation. Now, we know again from historical sources that there was extensive Roman occupation, not only in the fortress, but on this side of the river as well, and that this occupation was of a rich kind that was thriving round about 200 when it was given colonial status. We have here a piece
We're almost at the end of our summer of archaeology in York.
perhaps at a later
In
period.
this film, we've looked in detail at 4 sites, and from each of them, something new was learned. The cattle market. This was proved always to have been open ground. The Ebor brewery site. This turned out to have been almost certainly the site of St. Helen's Church. The Bedern site. This showed the continuation of the present street in the medieval layers, and it's hoped to discover a lot more about the Vicar's Choral. Skeldergate, excavation of medieval wharfside buildings, and Bishop Hill, excavation within the Roman Colonia and of the Duke of Buckingham's house. All these sites, except the Bedern, were undertaken in the face of immediate redevelopment. So let's go back to Bishop Hill and see what was happening at the end of November 1973.
Now all that remains will be wiped away to make way for a new multi-storey car park. The opportunity came, we took it, and now it's gone. This is the essential problem of rescue archaeology. But this site, and others like it as the Trust's work proceed, will provide new pieces of evidence which will enable historians to reconstruct in more detail than has ever in the past been possible the conditions of life, the various achievements and aspirations of the people who have lived in York for 1900 years and who have together laboured to make it what it is today.